Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Red Effect Podcast. Today, we got a couple new faces here, so I'm going to start right here. This is Truman. Truman, can you tell us what you do and who you work for?
Sure. Happy to be here, Coltin. Thanks for having us. My name is Truman Faeh. I'm with Lincoln Capital, and we are investment advisors out of Lincoln, Nebraska. We work closely with farm families across Nebraska and several states now, and we coordinate the financial planning that we do here with Zach's firm.
Okay, perfect. So, Zach, can you introduce yourself and who you work for and what you do?
Absolutely. Zach Peterson, like Truman mentioned, with Dvorak Law Group, based in Omaha, but do have offices in Hastings, Columbus, Sutton, and Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So national presence, but regional firm. My practice is primarily focused on estate planning, tax planning, succession planning, with a pretty heavy focus on farming, ranching, agricultural families.
Perfect. And then on the very end, we got Andy Method. Andy, you want to tell everybody what you do here at REDSTAR?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Andy Method. So at REDSTAR, what I primarily do is I oversee a lot of the financials that go on with REDSTAR and helping make financial decisions for REDSTAR. So that's why we have Zach and Truman here today is, we uncovered some things in the business that we thought were very valuable and can help benefit our customers as they look forward into the future and see the transition plans from them to their families and so on down the line.
Perfect. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about transfer of assets, specifically farmland. And with 65% of our landowners in the United States being over the age of 65, and that's retirement age, and as we go on, as the baby boomers start to exit the marketplace and start to, I don't know how to put this other than they start to die off, it's going to be the largest transfer of assets in world history because the baby boomers own a significant portion of it. So we got you guys here today to talk about how we can do that, what's the best way to do that. And so first, I want to go from the viewpoint, say you are a 65, 70-year-old grower. What are some steps you need to take to ensure that that piece of ground, that whether your parents bought it, you bought it, stays in the family name for generations to come?
Truman, want to start off?
Yeah. So just a little background on myself. So I'm originally a farm boy from central Nebraska. And so this is an issue that, my family is navigating through at the moment and several of our clients. And if I think about, 10 of my buddies that I grew up with from agricultural backgrounds, there's probably about 20% of them that came back to farm, right? So in the way of succession from our perspective, a lot of times what we see is that you have maybe a kid or two that's active in that operation, and then a couple kids that have gone on to do something else, because as we know, the reality is a guy can farm a couple of 1,000 acres with maybe a hired man, anymore. And so farming's just changed a lot over the last, especially decade and a half. So from our perspective, we understand that the most important thing to that family is not their IRA accounts, it's not their brokerage accounts, it's the ground, right? And so, making sure that you have positioned yourself to equalize that estate, that's become a huge issue where, maybe one of your kids is going to take over that farming operation, but how do we make that, I'm going to use air quotes when I say fair, because especially in these scenarios, fair is not always equal, right? So we use, tools like life insurance, some different strategies with your IRA to help facilitate that transition, because it's all about making sure that you have enough liquidity, which in a lot of operations there's not, right? There's not. In order to facilitate that transition in conjunction with, some really solid estate and succession planning, which is where Zach comes in.
Absolutely. So I guess from the starters, and this is probably common knowledge to both you two and probably a lot of the audience, but talking about taxes, because there's really two things that can kill a transfer. One would be taxes, and the second one is probably family dynamics.
And in
involved.
life, the only two guarantees are death and taxes.
Correct.
And when you own land, in the event of death, taxes again.
Correct. Yeah, both of these are going to happen.
Yes.
No matter how much people want to avoid it, the number one thing that you need to do is start the conversation. I would say if you're in your 65 and 70s, it's never too late. And while no plan is perfect, it's I guarantee you it's better than having. I mean, having a plan is better than having nothing in place. And so, from a taxes, there's really two taxes at play here. One is the federal estate tax, which usually generates the most headlines. The death tax, people call it. Right now, the good news is while values are high, so is the exemption in a relative, perspective. So, currently the federal estate tax exemption is $13.99 million per person. Now, that's the highest it's ever been. We'll see what happens. There has been a bill that was introduced by the Senate. The House may have also introduced a bill proposing to get rid of the estate tax. Now, I don't think there's enough traction to actually pass that. However, I'm sure people are aware of that happening. So essentially, call it $28 million if you're a married couple, which is a lot of exemption. However, I will say when ground is selling at $10,000, $15,000 an acre, it doesn't take very many sections or quarter sections of ground to get up to that point. So
Now, is that $28 million per side of the family, or is that combined so both your sets of your parents are gone and you guys have received over $28 million, then that tax kicks in?
So the federal estate tax is each person has a bucket of dollars they can use either during their life or upon death. So each person gets $13.99 million of exemption. So if you have two parents, $28 million, round up. If you don't have any, if there's only one individual, then only $13.99 million. It's a great question, though. However, there's some different strategies that we can employ to probably inflate that to probably closer to $40 million based off various discounts and different strategies we can utilize if planning is handled in advance. So that's the federal level. Now, Nebraska, if you live in Nebraska, does have a state level inheritance tax, much lower percentage. So that exemption for the federal estate tax it's a 40% tax once you get above $13.99 million. So it's a big percentage-wise tax. Nebraska is only going to tax you at 1% if it's going to a lineal descendant. However, if you start talking about individuals who are further related, so if you're talking about, you see it fairly frequently, girlfriends, boyfriends, nieces, nephews, then you get as high as 13 to 15%. So that can be a more punitive tax the higher you get. So those are really the two taxes at play. The third one I would mention is also the step-up in basis, which I'm sure everybody who's been around farming is probably well aware of. And the best part of dying is probably the fact that your ground gets a basis step-up when you pass away. Now, the downside is you have to die. And the second downside is it's got to be below those exemption numbers to capture that without triggering a federal estate tax. So that's really the tax side of things. Now, I think the tax side of things is often the easier side to handle, quite frankly. If you get it in front of good counsel, financial advisors, accountants, attorneys early enough, not to put ourselves in that camp for a plug, but I will say if you get in front of them early enough, you can usually mitigate the vast majority of the taxes. And if you can't mitigate them, you can usually utilize insurance or something similar to offset liquidity concerns. The bigger issue probably is what Truman mentioned, which is how do you make things fair amongst your family members? Because usually there's one or more who are actively involved with the operation. If everybody's involved or nobody's involved, it's relatively easy. If there's only one person involved and there's three or four who aren't, then you start to talk about what is fair and what are the structures you can put in place to continue that legacy on to the next generation. And Truman mentioned a few: life insurance, utilizing non-egg assets, putting entities in place where it's an LLC or a limited partnership or something where management is consolidated and maybe voting and non-voting units are used to differentiate between the two. So there's different strategies at play, but I think at least having the conversation is very critical when you're, no matter what age, but certainly 65 or 70.
Okay. So changing gears now, someone my age, I'm 26 years old, and obviously both sets of my grandparents are getting pretty old. Now, on one side of the family, we got everything pretty well taken care of already. But on the other side, it's taken care of. My mom's a single child, so we know that. But say it wasn't that way. Say it was an aunt and uncle that there's 20 different nieces and nephews, and some of them helped them through their life, some of them didn't. How do you go about starting those conversations?
if you're in the 26-year-old shoe
Yep.
or the 30, those can be delicate conversations, I will say. I'll play a lawyer answer. It depends. It depends on the family. It depends on the individuals. I think you have to be somewhat delicate about approaching them, depending on what the relationship is like. What I will say is, oftentimes, an easy way to get into it is, the individuals doing planning themselves and then talking, whether it's over, a cocktail or Christmas or Thanksgiving, just saying, we just did our estate plan and we met with this advisor and we thought it was helpful. And did you know that here are the various items and risks that are at play? And I think people usually know they need to have the conversation. It's just multiple elements, dealing with the mortality. It's an easy thing to put off and back burner. What I will tell you is the cost and the pain going into planning is dwarfed in comparison to the cost and the pain associated with not doing the planning, because the amount of post-death litigation that we've dealt with as a firm is astronomical, and the price is usually 20x, 50x going through that.
So, and we've all heard the horror stories of mom and dad pass away tragically and there is no will, and then it's almost a free-for-all amongst the siblings to figure out where everything goes.
The state has a plan, and it's not a good one, is it, Zach?
Correct. And knowing those dynamics and being able to have hard conversations. And I do think generationally, this is painted with a broad brush, so excuse me for that, but painting with a broad brush, generationally, the generation a couple generations above us is usually more reticent to having the conversation with the children. But I think opening that dialogue and having those tough conversations early on, I have seen very, on paper, unequal estate plans that result in very harmonious post-death relationships. I've seen situations where the active kid walks away with $10 million of ground, and the inactive kids walk away with $1.5 million of life insurance each, and they're happy with that because there's a difference between cash in the bank versus ground that's only producing X amount of dollars you don't control, and nobody wants to. And I do think the idea of the legacy is important, and I think that's maybe one thing to bring up too is what's the family's legacy, because I don't know the stats as well as Truman probably does or you guys probably do, but the amount of businesses, and farming is a business. That's all. That's all. It's just a type of business. Farming is no different than, it's different, but it's a similar concept to just any family business. And the percentages of first generation, second generation, third, fourth, they're pretty stark when you look at how many fourth, fifth generation family businesses are. It's not very many. Probably single digits. Probably low single digits. And so I think most people want those things to continue. And farming is hard nowadays. It's never been easy, but if you're just starting out in farming, I could not just go to a bank, borrow a bunch of money, start buying ground and equipment, and make it as a farmer. It's impossible. You have to have a pretty good head start. And so focusing on that legacy and what that looks like is usually critical.
Yeah, I go back to your same question you just asked, Cole, and I was in that same situation with my parents. It's not a fun conversation to have. The minute you have that conversation, they think two things. What are you trying to get at? And are you trying to kick me out and take over? And for me, it's not so much that. I do want to take over the farm one day. That's my legacy. But I want to have something in place so when they do pass, that it's protected and we can continue that legacy instead of having to sell X amount of pieces just to cover those taxes. So I guess what are some things that, we could put into place, or the farmer or the operation can put into place to help them succeed for the next generation down the road?
Well, as far as there's different tools certainly available from an estate planning standpoint. I mean, most plans we utilize nowadays will involve one or more revocable or irrevocable trusts. And trusts sound complicated. They sound expensive. Like I mentioned on the front end, or just a little bit ago, the cost of putting a trust in place is far surpassed by the cost of having nothing in place. It does allow you to avoid a probate or an estate administration, which a lot of people are looking to avoid, which saves on costs, timing, some confidentiality benefits. You don't have everybody in town knowing every dollar you had when you passed away. There's also usually some sort of a family LLC or limited partnership or something that at least provides for a framework. Because if you have more, one or more non-active children, and you don't have enough assets, let's just say, for example, you have $20 million of ground, but you only have $2 million of life insurance. Well, that might be an inequitable, disparity between the two. And it's also possible, depending on the health, that insurance might be too expensive. Now, if you work with Truman, he can probably get you something good. But but for a lot of individuals, it can be too expensive. And so putting that framework in place where not only do you have a situation where the ground can be managed or the operation can be managed during mom and dad's life without them giving up control, but put the framework in place so we know when they pass away who's going to be able to take over as manager. They've got confidence that the active kid can make the decisions. You don't have to worry about a partition action or something whereby a disincentivized kid goes and runs to the courthouse and files a partition action and forces a sale of all the ground. So I just think, putting the framework in place, and I would say most patriarchs, matriarchs know they need to do something. And what I'll tell you is the comfort they get post-planning being completed, that there's something that's going to be preserved, is usually well worth the hard conversation on their end.
And I think Truman said this earlier in the podcast, but it resonates a lot. What is fair is not always equal. Mm-hmm. So especially when you look at the people that put in sweat equity into the farm and are there day to day versus the people that have potentially moved away and never been back to the farm at all. It's up to that patriarch or matriarch to decide what is that balance and relationship of does he or she get 10 million and does the other person only get 2? I think having that conversation up front with both of those individuals before they pass away, if they can, it resonates a lot too, so everyone is on the same playing field and understanding what the end goal of the operation is for when the time does come.
And I forget which one of you, but you mentioned starting your plan early, telling the descendants who are going to receive this the plan. So how much do you guys put into the matriarch, patriarch, setting the plan, and then going back to the kids to get their responses to it? Do you think a lot of them are going to be like, this is what we came up with, this isn't going to change? Or do you think a lot of them are willing, once you go back, if you have a good argument, not just, well, that my name's on that too. And like Andy said, and I hear stories about it all the time online. I don't know how true they are, but like the kid who put in all the sweat equity ends up having to split the ground 4 ways because his 3 kids or his 3 siblings that went to the city came back and decided they wanted that ground too. Mm-hmm. So I guess what would be your way of navigating that?
Well, I'll tell you the horror stories are true. I mean, we've dealt with some of the horror stories, and it's great for lawyers. I mean, if you're a lawyer, nobody do planning, and we'll make more money when everybody fights us out in the back end. But that's not how our firm is set up, and that's, I do think having the conversation can be hard, and it really depends on the family. Some people have done really good family meetings post-planning where it's presented not as much in a, I'm soliciting feedback, more so in a, here's why we did this. Here's the intention behind it. We didn't just do this to be mean or play favorites or be unthoughtful. This was to minimize taxes, make sure this legacy can continue, make sure everybody is treated fair, whatever fair means. And there might be some blowback. There might be some feedback that is, not overly well received. But I do think at least having the conversation. Now, some people don't want to have the conversation, and that's fine. And we can have the conversation. And I think if you don't want to have the conversation, at least be willing to share with the attorney or family friends or other advisors of the why behind your plan. Because I think if you can spell it in a way or leave a guidance letter or something that says, here's why we did it. Now, you can't prevent certain individuals from, you can never stop somebody from filing a lawsuit. Let's start with that premise. You can always find somebody who will file a lawsuit. But I do think if you're willing to just be honest, be direct, most families are very, we're talking about the 1% on both sides, mm-hmm. really. The people that make the Reddit forums about the disputes, that's usually the minority. But it's a strong minority, and it can, and you know what your family dynamics are. Mom and dad know the family dynamics that are at play.
So of the percentage of people out there, what percentage do you think, as of today, in that group that's over 65, have a plan locked and loaded to just act upon?
That's a good question. I should know the answer to that. I'm going to guess less than 25% probably.
Really?
Have that plan in place. And they probably don't have it up. If they have a plan, it probably hasn't been looked at in a long time. The life cycle we usually see is people don't have a plan. They get married. They have a kid or two. And they think, oh, crap, we need to have an estate plan. They get together a basic will. It's made some powers of attorney. And then they do nothing until their parents die. And then they say, "Oh, we haven't looked at this in a long time. We should probably update it." And what I do think is the nice part about the other conversation you mentioned is when the parents put a plan in place, that gives an opportunity for the kids to also get a plan in place that dovetails nicely between the two. Because, if you're in your 70s or 80s, you probably don't only have, at that point, your kids are probably looking at retiring. You probably have grandkids who have started to enter into the picture and taking over the operation. And you never know, maybe one of your inactive kids has an active grandchild. So having those conversations, and to your point, Colton, plan for the now, but recognize you need to have flexibility for the future. So even if you're using an irrevocable trust or something that on its face sounds very rigid, we are always going to build in flexibility whereby they can be addressed in the future as those things present themselves.
And just to add to that, Zach, this is where I would advocate for Dvorak law. We've had several clients tell us like, hey, we have a plan in place and we put it in place back in 1997 and we feel really good about it, right? And we might say something like, well, there's wisdom in at least having that plan reviewed, and the amount of misunderstanding about what the client thought that plan was going to accomplish after they had it reviewed and updated. You typically always find something, Zach, right?
We typically do, but if we don't, at the same time, I do think having a second set of eyes or a second opinion and having some continuity, a lot of, if your attorney is either deceased or retired or bordering on either of those two things, it doesn't hurt to have some sort of succession from an advisor standpoint as well. And that's not just a plug for, we have older attorneys in our firm and we have younger, but having some succession from the advisor standpoint as well, because if the client is 80, the attorney's 80, and the financial advisor's 80, and then people start dying, who are the kids going to go to?
Yeah.
And then they have to find their own people to put the plan in place. So if you have some continuity from that standpoint, we're not going to create work for the sake of doing work, but put something in place from an advisor continuity as well. And that goes for life insurance and stuff too. Truman stumped for me, I'll stump for him. But a lot of people, have old policies or investments or annuities or any of these sort of products that have been in place for a long time. There's been a lot of changes in the legal side, the financial markets, the industries over the last 20 years. So having periodically dusting that stuff off, having a second set of eyes is always a good idea.
Okay. So you brought up like the investments, things like that. So when you're doing your estate planning, say grandma invested in some fruit company in the 80s, it just so turned into be Apple and it's worth a lot. Do you guys discover that when you guys are setting up the plan? Do you look at all the different assets there are that may have been forgotten?
That's always our objective. And we work from a holistic perspective. Generally speaking, most of our clients are referral based, whether it's clients referring us in, financial advisors such as Lincoln Capital, bankers, whoever it might be, the CPAs. So I do think we want to, to the extent possible, touch base with those other advisors and make sure there's a holistic team in place, because if we're doing changes of ownership, if we're funding irrevocable trusts, if we're making transfers, the CPA is going to want to know about that. We're going to want to make sure the investment advisor is aware of the modifications so they can update any beneficiary designations. Bankers are certainly going to care to the extent there's outstanding debt, loans. So yes, the short answer is, the first part of our engagement is always more fact gathering, seeing what we can get, and to the extent we can work with existing relationships, that's always our preference.
Perfect. Do you have something, Andy?
Yeah, so Truman, I'm just kind of thinking of maybe some clients, they come in and they don't have anything planned out. What are some of the first steps that you're going to do with them to say, hey, this is what we need to do, this is what you need to do to make sure that they're getting everything squared away?
Sure. Yeah. A lot of the focus, anymore for our clients is thinking about how we position assets and what are the future tax ramifications of placing assets in XYZ account. Our country right now is in a tremendous amount of debt, and we've got a lot of clients that have for years their accountants told them, hey, put away dollars inside of your pre-tax IRA. What that accountant may not have counted for is how successful some of these folks have gotten. And now we run into issues like a federal estate tax bill, and assets like traditional IRAs are very difficult to shelter from a federal estate tax liability. And so a lot of that, to answer your question, Andy, is coordinating with the attorney. Making sure that we're placing these assets or transitioning these assets into a spot that's going to be more tax favorable to either the client or ultimately their heirs.
So one thing too that I see happen a lot is we have a trust with mom and dad. Well, then mom and dad go to the nursing home, and after a while they're there, they forget who they are. So obviously they can't make very good decisions about that. Do you have a lot of clauses in there where it sets up like, hey, once X, Y, and Z happens, whoever is the power of attorney, maybe it's one sibling, maybe it's two, they take over that trust until mom and dad pass away?
Absolutely. And I think the benefit of utilizing a revocable trust versus just a will is a will doesn't take effect until you die.
Okay.
So until you're deceased, a will not take effect. And the will is only going to govern the assets that you die owning in your own name, so the assets that are in your estate. So I do think there's a lot of misconceptions about what the different documents do and the interplay between them. The nice part about a revocable trust is once you establish that trust, that's an actual living, breathing entity that exists. And that's why I think, to your point, Coltin, building in succession of not only advisors, successor trustees, but if you have an operating business, I mean, look at REDSTAR. If something were to happen to the ownership, who is the key management or advisory team that can shepherd along the trustee? Because maybe you want your successor trustee to be your brother because he's got the best relationship with your kids, but he's a lawyer in Omaha. He doesn't know how to run a farming operation. He doesn't know how to run an operating business. So if that's the case, making sure there's those key advisors in place to kind of take over, because I will say incapacity, I mean, what happens if you don't have a power of attorney or a trust? Well, then you're talking about guardianships, conservatorships, which are never fun. I mean, it's a drawn out kind of court proceeding that they're not overly complicated, but they're clunky, right? And so kind of having that in place, does create a whole lot of, plus if you have outside advisors, you have business relationships, they want to know that there's a succession built in place whereby, maybe Colton's their guy or Andy's their guy or Truman's their guy. Well, what happens when they're gone? What happens if the proverbial grain truck hits them, on the way home from work? Well, they want to make sure that they've got someone to deal with, because a lot of these operations, I mean, right now we're talking about, farming, which is somewhat static in terms of the ground value is not going away. But if you're an individual who's got an operating business that's more service-based, that's more relationship-based, well, what does that look like long-term? How do you get those, how do you build in that succession and sort of that protection?
So basically build in a doomsday protocol.
Build in a doomsday protocol. Yes, we're all going to die. We're all going to move on. We're all going to get some element of dementia, hopefully, right? The alternative is the grain truck, I guess. And so, making sure that succession is in place. And then as far as, working with a financial team to kind of put, investments, and I agree with Truman, taxes probably aren't going, maybe they'll go down in the immediate term, given the administration, but long term, they got to go up at some point. You got $40 trillion of debt, and somehow it's got to get paid for. So what does that look like? I don't know. I'm not in Congress, thank God. But someone's going to have to figure that out, and it's going to be taken from somewhere.
Yeah, common sense would say higher taxes in the future.
Correct.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a pretty safe bet.
So jumping back to Colton and I, younger kids in this generation coming up in agriculture. I mean, I currently have a will. You mentioned it earlier. Like I had a moment in life, like, hey, I need to get a will together. So I put a will together. Haven't looked at it since. A lot of things have changed since then. How often do you recommend people looking at their will and updating their will for what they have in their life?
So that's always part of the conversation when people sign their documents. I mean, one of the documents that our firm always has clients sign are just periodic notifications to remind, we'll reach out every 2 years, every year, every 3 years, every 5 years, depending on what the client wants us to do. But I would say there's those key moments in life, birth of a child, when you have a significant increase of, financial net worth, whatever that means. Maybe you bought Bitcoin and now, holy hell, I have Bitcoin, right? Maybe it's that death, divorce. As you continue to age, I mean, every situation is different. It doesn't hurt probably every 2 or 3 years to just dust it off, pull out the binder, see what you put together, if it still works. Because, for me, for example, I mean, the little big things, right? The guardians and conservators of my kids, which financially doesn't mean a whole lot, but I've got twin 5-year-old girls. So what I probably care more about is that who they're living with more so than who's managing the money. I can find any bank or individual to not lose the money, hopefully. I can't find that many people to raise my 5-year-olds in a way I want them raised. Right. And so, things along those lines, pull it out. My sister-in-law got divorced, so that changed our guardians and conservators. And so recognizing when those big life events happen, that's usually when you want to at least look at them. But every 2 or 3 years probably makes some amount of sense. And it doesn't need to mean a full meeting. You could just pull it out, make sure it's good to go, and move on with life.
Perfect. So one situation, I'm just going to throw it out there. Your long-lost Uncle Warren dies, and you inherit 1,000 acres. Or whether mom and dad do pass away, and you do inherit enough land where you're going to have to pay taxes on it. So can you explain how the Section 180 could help you cover some of those taxes that you would incur because of that?
For sure, and I'm still waiting for an Uncle Warren that I've not seen on my family trees yet. But to the extent Uncle Warren does show up, hopefully he's listening to this podcast and he remembers me. So Section 180, what you're talking about is really nutrient depreciation and different ways you can maximize tax benefits associated with agriculture. And I will say, Section 180 has been around for a while. I'm not an accountant. I'm not an agronomist who does these studies, but I will say in the last 3 to 4 years, probably, we've seen a lot of clients take advantage of Section 180 in a way that wasn't done in the past. And generally speaking, for those who don't know, Section 180 is the ability to depreciate, and I believe it's a refundable credit as well. Don't quote me on that, but to depreciate the nutrient, the idea behind it is your soil has nutrients, and over time, that will depreciate in value. No different than if you buy an airplane, if you buy a vehicle. Over time, it's going to get less and less valuable based off of, being utilized, farming, et cetera. So the idea is what you would do is put together some sort of agronomist report. We've got individuals we've worked with that we could certainly recommend if people are interested, who can put together a report in conjunction with your CPA. And the idea would be, through this report, file a tax return or file amended tax returns to the extent it's happened in the past, and depreciate that that nutrient density on your soil over a period of time. And we've seen clients, not to quote and make people overly optimistic, but we've seen clients obtain 7-figure tax refunds based off of that. So what I would say is not to focus too much on Section 180, but to the extent you inherit a highly appreciating asset, you want to make sure that you're very aware of what that asset means going forward from a tax standpoint, from a management standpoint, because unless you're involved with farming operations on a day-to-day basis, inheriting ground has a lot of benefits, but for better or worse, I would say for better, given the audience here, the federal government has given a lot of tax breaks and opportunities to farming operators. They just need to know how to use it. So the main thing there is make sure you're working with a good team, make sure you're with advisors, and know what's available from your standpoint.
Perfect. So I know it's a lot hard to put tile in here in Nebraska compared to where I'm from in Iowa. We can pattern tile anything we want. But is tile a reasonable way do you get a tax credit from making that investment to your land? Does that come off of taxes in any way, shape, or form by investing that into the land?
I don't know that to a certain extent. I mean, as much as we do have work in Iowa, that's probably more of a question for your CPA. But yes, certainly that goes back to the idea of making sure you're aware of what your inputs, whatever that is, if it's tile, if it's nutrients, if it's a new pivot, what does that mean from an expense? If it's a new truck, and what can you depreciate and what can you take as a deduction moving forward? And I do. That's the main takeaway I would say is making sure you've got a good CPA, make sure you got a good attorney, and then to the extent you need to bring in outside advisors, whether that's appraisers, agronomists, bankers, making sure you surround yourself with a good team who knows the answer to that question, because I don't.
Perfect. Anything else that you guys think we should cover? Any hot button issues that you guys are seeing?
the main takeaway is, have a plan in place. If you have a plan, make sure you're periodically reviewing it. And I really view this period of time as an opportunity and a planning window. I mean, yes, values have gone up tremendously. I mean, if you had told somebody 25 years ago you'd be selling irrigated ground at 10,000 plus an acre, they'd probably think you were insane. But that's the case, and it's continued to grow up in value. What are the reasons for that? I don't want to get into it all, but there's funds, there's institutional investors, there's the neighbor who's been eyeing that ground for 30 years, driving the value up. But what I would say is I'd view this as a planning opportunity. It wasn't that long ago that the exemption was $1 million per person, not $14 million per person. And back then, there were a lot of people selling off ground just to pay for the federal estate taxes owed. So what I would say is $28 million is a pretty healthy cushion for most of America. Not for everybody, but for those who are above it, there's different opportunities and planning windows in place. So I would view the next 2 to 3 to 4 years as just an opportunity to reevaluate what your plan looks like, because right now we're probably in a relatively favorable tax environment. I expect it to get slightly more favorable over the next year or two, but you know how politics works in the U.S. It swings, and Trump's not going to be president forever in spite of what he wants. But I would say is at some point they're probably going to swing the other direction. So view this as a planning opportunity to take advantage. No different than what Truman would probably tell you, but I'm going to guess a recession's a good time to invest in the market. But
it sure can be. Yeah. And I would just echo what Zach said there. My experience with our clients has been that farm families tend to significantly discount what they're actually worth and kick that planning can down the road as far as they can. And I do think we're living in a time where we've got a unique window to take advantage of very high exemptions, and waiting is not a good strategy in my opinion at this point.
And that's a good point, kicking the can down the road. When we look at our bank accounts, there's not much there, but when we look at our asset sheet, there's a lot there. So I love that idea of, you got to realize there's quite a bit of money wrapped up in this deal. So Andy, to you, you've been through this, it sounds like. What would be advice you would give to anybody who doesn't have the plan in place to go forward with it?
Yeah, my biggest thing is have that initial conversation with whoever needs to be in your family of, hey, we need to get something in place for if when the event does happen. I mean, we all want to think it's not going to, but it's going to happen at some point in our lives that your parents or whoever owns the ground passes away. So making sure that you have everything set up for when that does happen. Explaining that to everyone that's going to be involved in the plan, I think is beneficial too, so no one's caught off guard when something happens. And it's like I told everyone on our conference calls that we have on Tuesdays here, this meeting that we're having tonight after this podcast, it's something that people aren't running to a coffee shop and saying, hey, I got my succession plan, I got everything figured out, put in place. It's not like I had 300 bushel corn and whatnot. It's the best thing that ever happened. But it's the people that do listen and do take the time to do it are probably going to set the next generation up for success versus the people that don't.
Yeah, and I would agree that sometimes the most important conversations are often the hardest ones to have.
100%.
yeah, I mean, it's like going to the doctor, right? I mean, it's you can certainly never go to the doctor and deal with the issues when they come up, but it's always easier to kind of periodically, be checking, do your annual physicals and make sure you're. I mean, that's all it really is. It's a financial physical. It's just the ability for you to check out what your succession would look like, and it's a gift. That's the end of the day. It's a gift to the next generation. I mean, you are setting your kids up for success by doing planning, and ideally, it can be intimidating. It can sound like a lot. It can sound expensive. What I'll tell you is our firm at least does our best to be relatively approachable. We don't know everything. We know a lot, and I think we can try and be. Most people, when they finish their planning, have a more sense of relief. It's like, when you leave the doctor's office, you should leave and kind of breathe a sense of relief and feel better about going there. And that's the same way you should feel when you go to an attorney's office and hopefully an advisor's office, other than the last month, probably when the markets are down.
Yeah, we talked earlier about, either a business or farming operation that had been, in the family for 3 or 4 generations. And I think when I think about our client base, the commonality amongst those operations are families that are willing to have difficult conversations early and, often. So if you've been thinking about getting something done, I would encourage you to do it.
Perfect. Take action now.
Yep.
Exactly. I've done signings in hospital rooms, and I much prefer them do them at kitchen tables or our office.
Sounds a lot less morbid.
It is a lot less morbid.
Alrighty. Well, thank you everybody for being on. This was another episode of the Red Effect Podcast. The Red Effect Podcast is brought to you by REDSTAR. REDSTAR, where our red makes you green.